the Catholic Men's Podcast, helping you find good works of literature for the Catholic gentleman. The Fantastic Adventure by Greg Keaton. One night in 1944, two young British officers, both under 25, sat in a cafe in Cairo. On leave after a long spell of fighting, they were trying to think up a piece of devilment that would hurt the Nazis. Suddenly, they had an idea. Why not kidnap a German general? On the face of it, such a scheme was fantastic, but British military authorities in Cairo and London liked the idea. The victim decided upon was a distinguished member of Hitler's Wehrmacht, Major General Karl Crete, one of the heroes of Leningrad, now in command of the 22,000 German troops on the Greek island of Crete. Capturing him would upset German planning in the Mediterranean, and it would be a poke in the ribs that would bring a chuckle to the rebellious millions living under Nazi occupation. And people who laugh are at least not afraid. One February night, therefore, a British plane roared over a guerrilla hideout in the mountains of Crete. Out of it parachuted one of the two schemers, Major Patrick "Paddy" Lee Fermer, a handsome Irishman who was also a noted Greek scholar. But before his companion, Major W. Stanley Moss, could jump, the plane got lost in the clouds and was forced to turn back. Moss came back 10 times in the next 6 weeks through fog and flak, but each time failed to make contact with Lee Fermer and the Cretans. Finally arranging for an approach by sea, he slipped past the German coastal patrol boats in a launch one night and waded onto a mined beach. Lee Fermer and a band of murderous-looking Cretan mountain men were waiting there to help Moss pull through the surf the boatload of guns and ammunition he had brought. Then they set out in pitch darkness to climb the roller coaster goat trails to their first hideout. It would have been difficult going in daylight, but at night it was torture. When at 4 a.m. they arrived at the cave, their feet were blistered, their bodies black and blue from falls. For 2 more nights, the band marched north over trails used by German patrols. They hid out during the day with villagers. Moss and Lee Fermer passed the time reading Alice in Wonderland and the Oxford Book of Verse and listening to the clump of hobnailed boots as German soldiers tramped down the cobbled streets. Now, Paddy Lee Fermer rubbed his mustache with burnt cork, stuck his legs through ragged trousers, bound a kerchief over his head, and started down into Heraklion, the capital of Crete. He was to meet a guerrilla called Mickey Akumianakis. Mickey knew more about the activities of General Crete than anyone else. He lived next door to him. Quickly, Lee Fermer saw that a kidnapping raid on the general's residence was out of the question. The villa was surrounded by 3 rows of barbed wire charged with electricity and guarded by dogs and a platoon of troops. So for the next few days, the young Irishman watched from Mickey's window until he had a timetable of the general's movements. Each morning, the general drove from his villa to military headquarters 5 miles away. Every evening he returned after dark. This suggested that some night the kidnappers could trap him in his car. Studying the road, Paddy and Mickey found the perfect spot for a holdup, an L-turn so sharp that all cars were obliged to brake there and shift gears. Paddy then returned to the hideout to confer with Moss. Their evolving plan called for 12 men, 8 hidden in the ditches alongside the road, and 4 stationed ahead to warn of the general's approach. The 2 British officers were to masquerade as German military police. For this purpose, the guerrillas got hold of 2 German uniforms. By now, the Germans had got wind of a British party of some sort on the island, and the little band was kept stumbling up and down the mountains each night to a new hideout. They slept in caves or lofts. Once they sat in a loft, their automatics trained on the door, while 4 Germans banged around downstairs demanding food. By April 23rd, preparations were complete. The operation was scheduled for the following night, and then General Crete upset the timetable. For 3 nights in a row, he came home while it was still light, as if he suspected something was afoot. On the 4th day, the British officers watched the daylight fade and the darkness come, and no sign as yet of the general. This was it. The 12 men took their places at the ambush. They waited an hour. Finally, the spotters' flashlights blinked. A car flying 2 metallic pennants came down the road. As the car slowed for the L-turn, Lee Firmer and Moss, wearing correct German MP uniforms, waved it to a halt. Paddy opened the right-hand door and pulled Crete out into the road. The two rolled over and over, Crete cursing, kicking, and lashing out with his fists until 3 guerrillas handcuffed him and tossed him into the back of the car. When the chauffeur reached for a pistol, Moss blackjacked him and dumped him into a ditch. Now Paddy put on the general's hat and took the general's place beside the driver's seat. Moss slid behind the wheel. Manoli Peterakis and George Tyrakis, 2 of the guerrillas, sat in the back, Crete between them. Soon after they started down the road, they saw the swinging red lamp of a German control post. Tyrakis unsheathed his knife and made clear to Crete what would happen if he dared call for help. The sentry stepped to one side as the car approached. Moss slowed to let him see the flags on the fenders, then roared on. When the kidnapping expedition came abreast of General Crete's home, the gates swung open. 2 guards stiffened to attention. Moss honked the horn, Lee Firmer motioned that he would not be entering, and the car whirled on. Altogether, they went through 22 German control posts. Their worst moments were in Heraklion, where the movies had just let out. The streets swarmed with German soldiers. Moss tooted, the troops saluted. Paddy Lee Firmer, imposing in the general's hat, nodded back, stone-faced. Once through the city, we felt a terrific elation, wrote Moss in his book telling of the exploit. We started discussing what sort of celebration we would have when we got back to Cairo. But Cairo was still a long way off. They abandoned the car now and took to the mountains, knowing full well that every single one of the 22,000 Germans on Crete would soon be hunting the general throughout the island's 35-mile width and 165-mile length. By mid-afternoon of the next day, the sky was full of planes with observers scanning the countryside through binoculars. Every now and then they would let fall a snow of leaflets. Quote, "If General Crete is not returned within 3 days, all rebel villages in the Heraklion district will be razed." End quote. The Germans did dynamite Anoia, a 900-year-old town, and then dive-bombed what masonry was left standing. Each night the kidnappers fled east and south. The general turned out to be a rather pleasant fellow. He kept pace with the others on their nightly marches and accepted his embarrassing plight without complaint. Sometimes, however, he worried about his numerous sisters. He, a bachelor, had long provided for them, but in the German army, allotments ceased the moment a soldier was taken prisoner. Meanwhile, Lee Firmer and Moss were becoming haggard over their failure to contact a radio operator who could confirm arrangements with Cairo about their escape ship. Then one night, stumbling into a guerrilla hideout, they heard an English voice, and there was the man they were looking for. But when he tried to send their message, nothing happened. His transmitter was out of order. It looked as if their early good fortune was finished. They dispatched runners to the only other 2 radiomen on the island, asking them to transmit a message to Cairo. But these operators were a long way off, and now the Germans were organizing for a massive drive up and through the mountains. One afternoon, an urgent message reached the weary band. One of the guerrillas, translating rapidly, reported that truckloads of soldiers were preparing to encircle the mountain on which they were hiding. They must make a break for the coast at once. This meant climbing at night at a fast clip over Mount Ida, 8,000 feet high. They left at dusk and climbed for 12 hours. Soft snow concealed treacherously deep crevasses. At the summit it started drizzling. The men had no food, and for shelter they found only a shepherd's crumbled, roofless hut. There they waited until night, freezing, then started the descent. It took us 2 hours, stumbling and falling, to reach the bottom of the snowbelt, wrote Moss in his diary, and then we found ourselves groping through stunted trees. Twigs would snap back in your face, and brambles would tear at your clothes and hands. The mood of the guerrillas became so ugly that Moss and Lee Firmer felt concerned for the safety of the general. Sitting in a ditch 24 hours later, in a downpour, shivering and miserable after accomplishing what must have been a record-breaking ascent and descent, Lee Firmer reread the message that had sent them scrambling over Mount Ida. The guerrilla had made a mistake in translating it. Far from urging them to go over the mountain, it had implored them not to move. Then another piece of bad luck. When they got to the beach where they planned to wait for their getaway, they found 200 Germans encamped there. Now a whole new set of arrangements had to be made. When at last a radio operator was located, a new rendezvous was suggested. "We are feeling the anticlimax of this business acutely," Moss wrote a week later. "It seems that we now have everything to lose and nothing whatever to gain." But at this point, with the Germans sniffing in narrowing circles all around them, their luck turned. A murderer and 2 sheep thieves joined the group. "They are the shiftiest-looking men I have ever set eyes upon," wrote Moss. "However, they have a matchless knowledge of every path and track, which makes them peerless as guides." So, assisted by their new guides, the kidnappers continued to elude the German troops. The night of May 14th, after almost 3 weeks of flight, they were awakened by a messenger. "A boat is coming for you at Rodokino Beach tomorrow night. You'll have to hurry to get there in time." Led by their sheep thieves, they raced up and down the mountainsides, hour after hour, arriving at noon on a hill overlooking the beach. Downshore, in full view of their binoculars, was a German camp. Less than a mile upshore was another. At 9 p.m., they slid down to the beach between the two. And then the most welcome sound in the world, a low throb of motors. Safely in Cairo 3 days later, Patty and Moss bade the general goodbye. "He smiled at us with a rueful, though kindly expression," said Moss, and then he was gone. Major General Crete was taken to a prison camp in England. Lee Firmer and Moss were both awarded Britain's Distinguished Service Order. Crete became a bond salesman in Germany after the war. He held no grudge against Moss and Lee Firmer, for the adventure had saved his life. The other 2 German generals in command of the Cretan garrisons were executed as war criminals by sentence of a Greek tribunal. End of The Fantastic Adventure by Greg Keaton. Everything in this story was true, and it shows you that truth is always way better than fiction, because this is worlds ahead of any spy novel that I've ever read. So thank y'all so much for listening, and I just wanted to bring up something new. If y'all have any new ideas for another story I could read, there's a link in the podcast info that will take you to my voicemail account, and you can just send me a 90-second message about the next story you want me to read, or a question you might want to ask me. You know, it might be fun, but just be advised that your voice may be used in one of the podcasts, but don't be worried about that. So again, thank you all so much for listening, and Godspeed.